Hi, I'll continue on where I left off in the last video. And if you take another look at that figure 29, what you would as well notice is that those two figures, the two figures that express the quintessence of the trill, that they are identical in design to the two figures occurring in Mozart's Rondo Alla Turca. The first you'll find in the opening section that's repeated, the first section that's repeated. And the second figure you'll find in the second repeated section. And what Mozart is doing there with those appoggiaturas, with the way he's written it, with those notes, is he is presenting the quintessence of the trill. And you can think for yourself, like, if you think of it, that Mozart is presenting the quintessence of the trill in Rondo Alla Turca. Both those examples that Bach adds there, he uses both. As he uses, like with a normal length trill, he uses both of those versions of trills in his pieces. You could then see that Rondo Alla Turca, those two sections are full of trills. And then you can wonder, how does that fit into the idea of Turkish music? I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on Turkish music, but you could wonder that. And you could wonder as well how they fit into the other ornaments that Mozart added to those sections, like the schneller. And I don't know what the English term for is that. I'll probably look it up then when we get to that ornament in Bach's book. But at the moment I don't know what you'd call that in English. So in German it's called the schneller, or Bach would call it the schneller. So you could wonder, how do all those trills fit in or contribute to the unity of the concept of the music? And so while the roll of honor would see those figures, like that second figure in figure 29, and in the second bar of how it's meant to be performed, while the roll of honor would see those as 4 equal notes, or 4 to be played simply as 4 semiquavers, or 4 16th notes. Basically, they just see them as 4 notes, and they'd play them as 4 notes. One could see them rather as 4 notes of one ornament on one note. That's 2 levels above the roll of honor. The roll of honor is here, they see it as 4 notes. Whereas Bach and Mozart will see it as 4 notes of one ornament on one note. And that's where they are. And when you listen to my upload of Rondo Alla Turca, with that figure the way I performed that figure, that can be heard. When you understand, or when you know what it is you're listening to, you then start to hear it as it's meant to be heard. Because I think before you know any of this information, before you know how to regard it, what you'll hear is a version of Rondo Alla Turca that's done differently than other versions. And so what you'll be hearing is what I do with that figure, as opposed to what the roll of honor do with that figure. But if you understand that what I'm doing, if you stop listening to it as just not being that what the roll of honor does, and understand it as the quintessence of the trill, so those 4 notes are actually one ornament on one note. And so instead of the melody being 4 notes, instead of it being that, it is actually that is the actual tune of it. And then what you're hearing, instead of the long note or over the long note, is the quintessence of the trill, of that second trill that Bach presents in figure 29. And I think that Rondo Alla Turca can be heard as one could hear it as an opera. And one could listen to it like that the opening section is like the narrator setting up the scene. And it's like, I don't know, this is up to, everybody can come up with their own scenario, but like, let's say it's like a marketplace, a Turkish marketplace. And then in the second section, what you get is the 2 characters are introduced. And one has their tune. And then he's answered by the other character who says, what you get is one character talking and the next character talking. And then the narrator comes in again. And then after that, you have the chorus coming in with the orchestra. And following that is the passages where Mozart would have said the semiquavers are to run like oil. And it could be that, just like Bach said in that example 27H, how he said, the way the Nachschläge was performed after the dotted note, that was incorrect. And he said that, if the composer wanted such a performance, he'd have to explicitly indicate it. And he went on to indicate it. And if you look at those 2 versions in figure 29, you could wonder, or I'd imagine Mozart wondering, how will I write that? How will I express that? And given, let's just assume that Bach wasn't an idiot, and that what he said at the end of paragraph 7 in the chapter on ornaments in general actually bore some relevance. Well, then Mozart could think, if I write that, those the quintessence of the trill, if I write it like it's written in that first bar, what'll happen is Lilliput will mess it up. Because what will they do then? They'll try and squeeze as many colourful notes in there as possible. Because Lilliput does not know of the existence of the quintessence of the trill. And what I would say, how, where's the proof in that? And I would say the way the trill is taught, in the way Lilliput teaches the trill, is the proof that they're completely oblivious to its existence. Because if I think of myself of learning the trill, like the first Mozart piano sonata I ever learned, there was one of those trills, the typical trills at the cadence, over an Alberti bass. And those will be like a cause of dread for people, as it was for me. I'm sure I was not the only person who dreaded those trills. I remember wondering about a piano concerto, playing a piano concerto by Mozart. And then I, went into the listening room in the conservatory, and I had the scores of the concertos, and I was looking for a concerto that didn't have that closing trill over an Alberti bass, because I was so traumatized. And I practiced it like Lilliput generally will recommend you practice it. I had the metronome going, and so for each note of the left hand, it would coincide with one tick of the metronome. And while that was happening, for each of those ticks, I'd play 2 notes of the trill. And so I do that as an exercise with the metronome, and then I'd try and get it so that when I played the last note in the left hand, I'd play the 2 notes of the Nachschläge, or the turn at the end of the trill. And so I do that, and then all the time raise the notch of the metronome. And with that, I as well include all those other tactics that Lilliput will recommend, that those in the cage will recommend, those cage activities they recommend, that which will as well involve, like, playing it in rhythms, or grouping, or breaking it up into rhythms. All these things, that it all falls into the same category. It's all cage activity. So I'd have done that. I'd have isolated that trill, and I'll have done that. And, and this will be for a sonata that I get in September, that will be used for my end of year exam. So I'll, on and off, spend the entire year practicing that in order to try and get it, to be able to play it at the end of the year in that exam. And I'll have practiced it like that with the metronome. And what happens when somebody does that? You start off with aspirations, and you feel like you're going to be disciplined, you're going to show self-restraint, and you're going to be grown up and mature about it. And you're not going to succumb to temptation. And you'll be congratulated on that work. When you've come back to your lesson after a week of that, you'll be congratulated for it. And said, well done, keep going with that. But what happens is, eventually, you get curious, because you're satisfied. You don't have to think. You have a routine that you can follow, and you're happy, because it's done. You can just have a kind of a smooth day. You don't have to. It's a bit of a grace period. So for a while you're happy with that. That's the cage. That makes living in the cage bearable. So you welcome that. But what happens is, eventually, you're going to get curious. You'll think, I did 2 weeks of this now. It must be, if you're really like showing a lot of self-restraint, you'll think, I'd like to see what sort of progress, what difference that made. And so then I'll have tried it up to full speed without the metronome as it's meant to be played. And the first time I'll try it, I won't hear it properly because I haven't been used to listening to it as it's meant to be played. I'm only used to hearing it as notes with a metronome. So I'll play it a few times because, to see what it is. And what'll happen is it will have disintegrated. In the space of a few goes, it'll go from what I'm not sure was it right or not, but it'll turn to just mush. And I'll lose it completely. And I'll be miserable. I was miserable. And what I'll think was, and what will be kind of said generally by Lilliput, those in the cage, those keeping you in the cage, it will be said that all that good work was undone by your lack of discipline. You tried it up to full speed too soon, and you undid all the good work you've been doing. And I'll have thought that about myself as well, that I undid all the good work I was doing. So what I'll do is I'll go back after being miserable and feeling that hopelessness. I'll go back to practicing with the metronome and resolve never to try it up full speed again until I've really, gotten the metronome up ticking quickly or whatever. And then I'll think it'll probably take a week to undo the slip I had where I was trying at full speed. It'll take a week to get back to the point I was where I was doing good work. And then keep going. And then what would happen through the years, the same cycle. You want to know what progress as I made, what good has this work done, and each time is the same. You try it starts to disintegrate before you, and you just feel miserable, and you keep reverting back to going back to the metronome, going back to the exercises, all those cage activities like grouping it, rotation, playing it in rhythms, all that sort of nonsense, because it is nonsense. It has nothing to do in the world of music. I always find it funny that people aren't able to play a dotted rhythm. And yet, like, a dotted rhythm is not an easy thing to play. You need to be out of the cage in the world of music to be able to play a dotted rhythm. Yet they think they're actually breaking up a technically difficult passage into dotted rhythms. They're not. They're not able to play a dotted rhythm. A dotted rhythm is as hard to play as as regular semiquavers. It's absurd. So, and what I'll have done then at the end of the year is, in my experience, is what I will, the theory I'll have formed in my mind is that since it was always too much of a shock to really know, I'll think that what that good work produces, like all those hours of isolating it and playing with the metronome, what they'll do is give me one or two good goes before it starts to disintegrate or deteriorate. So even on the day of the exam, what I'll have done was I'll have played that with the metronome, done it as the exercise. I'll have done the cage activity, and I won't try it at all up to full speed, because I feel like I'll burn that one or two goes I get out of all that work. And so I'll go into the exam hoping that I've coincided, that the one time it works out is there when I'm sitting in the exam. And of course, it doesn't work out. Because how can you possibly play something the way it's meant to be played when you've never played it the way it's meant to be played? And in all that year of practicing it, and I don't think my experience is so unusual, I think others will have had the same experience. I will have played that trill like thousands of times. And never will I have done, it's that what I'm talking about in the cage, never will I have done what Bach described in paragraph 8. Never. And never will it have been recommended to me. And I'll have gotten, you know, the way in conservatories or universities, they, you know, you take part in master classes. They have somebody coming along, a Lilliput roll of honor person, giving a master class. And and I'll have done that Mozart sonata in that master class, and they won't have said that what Bach talked about in paragraph 8. So in you know, in all the education, in that year of education, it won't have ever occurred that anybody talked about that, what Bach described. The up-close, magnified view of Bach himself playing a trill. Nobody will have said anything about it. And from that, that's where I draw my conclusion that Lilliput does not know of its existence. And I said in the description as well, I kind of said that, you know, I don't really recommend it, because when you start to, when you're learning what it is I'm sharing, you are becoming more advanced than your professors. And they don't appreciate that. So you have to, if you don't want to make life for yourself more difficult in university, if you don't want to get blacklisted or whatever, it's better you keep it to yourself. You become a double agent or a sleeper agent. Because as soon as you start showing up the professors with your knowledge and insight, they will punish you for that, because what you are doing is showing them up. And you might not believe me. You might think you know, you hear about professors gush about education and how wonderful it is and how, you know, one never stops learning. But they do not mean it. It is not sincere when they don't rejoice, they don't embrace insight and knowledge. Education is fine as long as they're the ones serving it, as long as they're the ones getting the fee, getting the money for that education. Then education is good. If education is coming from any other source other than from them, then they are the ones who are most against it. So they'll be against you. So you can't say it. But I said they're free. Just like I said about the short note following the dotted note, that there's something of great significance I have to share about that, and they're free to tell you what that is before I do. Well, they would have been free to tell you that what Bach was doing at the end of paragraph 8 was he was identifying the quintessence of the trill. They wouldn't have been able to do it. And it doesn't matter if they're in an elite university, it doesn't matter if they're the leading expert, they wouldn't have had a clue. And they never would have been able to connect the end of paragraph 8 with paragraph 18. And what you have, you can see in the second bar there, how would the roll of honor play that? How do they play that? And you can think of that sports hall again. And the roll of honor, all those on the roll of honor who have had anything to do with Rondo Alla Turca, they have all played it. If you think of those, that second bar in figure 29, that they represent the two, figures with a poggiaturus in those first two sections of Rondo Alla Turca, they play them as 4 equal notes. So if you divide them up again in the sports hall based on that criteria, they'll all be here, all of them. And you can, you'll see for yourself anytime you see somebody play Rondo Alla Turca who has earned a spot in that roll of honour. And then Bach will be here on his own, because Bach says in paragraph 8, he says in paragraph 18 that these produce the effect of a trill, and that appoggiatura is the highest tone of the trill the last time it occurs. And so in the end of paragraph 8, Bach describes exactly how that's to be performed. That last tone is to be hastened, i.e. it's a crushed note, to use today's, speak. Or it's an short unchangeable appoggiatura. That is how Bach is saying it is to be played. And that is how Bach would say Rondo Alla Turca is to be played. So Bach would be here. The roll of honour are here, and Bach is here. Lilliput does not know of the existence of the quintessence of the trill. But Bach does, and Mozart does. And Rondo Alla Turca is evidence that Mozart knew of the quintessence of the trill. Imagine Mozart walks into that sports hall. Who does he join? Does he join the roll of honour? Does he join Lilliput? Or does he join Bach? How did Mozart conceive it? Did he conceive them as trills, as adding to the, like the cymbals or the percussion of Turkish music, to the effect of Turkish music? How does those notes, not being four notes as Lilliput understands them to be, but being four notes of one ornament on one note, how does that play to the underlying rhythm of Turkish music, as opposed to just being four notes? And let's say Mozart goes over to Bach, because what you are hearing in my upload of Rondo Alla Turca is the correct answer. And the quintessence of the trill can be heard in that second figure. In the first figure, it's not so easy, because the Lilliput's version has been so pressed that it's very hard to get that out. But I think the second one, it's a bit easier to hear, to sense that is. And actually, it's the quintessence of the trill. You're getting something from Mozart, something exquisite from Mozart. The pure and concentrated essence of the trill is being captured and presented to you in that music. So Mozart goes over to Bach, and he doesn't even bother. What he says was, when I was writing Rondo Alla Turca, I had that choice. I could have written it, like in the first bar, with the trill sign over the note. I could have done that. But you know what I was thinking, Carl? I was thinking that if I do that, what Lilliput will do is they'll try and cram as many notes into that as possible. And that's not what I wanted. I want them to play the quintessence of the trill. So you know what I did? I wrote it out as I wanted to be performed. And still, they got it wrong. And Bach might say, Mozart, You can't underestimate mediocrity's ability to attack genius and eradicate genius. And you thought, yeah, if you do that, they'll understand, because they'll understand that it's the short, unchangeable appoggiatura, and that's how it's meant to be played. And they're not going to try and cram as many colourful notes into that trill as possible and ruin it that way. But what Mozart didn't anticipate, or Bach, was that what Lilliput would then do is they'd forget about the short, unchangeable appoggiatura. And they think they're being so clever, thinking that those appoggiaturas are there so that note isn't ornamented, and that's the only reason for its existence. They'll play it as equal semiquavers, because what happened as well, besides there's still that conception that of you know, that false prejudice that Bach is trying to get away with, you know, dispose of with this book, which didn't work, because, you know, Lilliput's ability, mediocrity's ability to attack genius knows no bounds. What became the thing is like this clockwork semiquaver stuff. Given the revolution, like you know, they dropped the metronome into the cage, and it was held aloft. It was worshipped by those in the cage. And it still is the ultimate tool of oppression. The ultimate tool to keep you in this cage was worshipped. And so then the metronome semiquavers became the one true God. So they forgot about the existence of the short, unchangeable appoggiatura. They thought every single appoggiatura that appears in a Mozart sonata is a long appoggiatura, because of their ignorance of the Abzug, because of all those things. So they found a new way to get it wrong. And despite Mozart's efforts, so in order to keep the length of the video under control, I'll end it here, and I'll continue on from where I left off in the next video. Thanks. Bye.